organ harvesting on prisoners of conscience in China under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. My name is Nico Benens. I'm president of the Falun Dafa Association here in Belgium, and I'll be your host during this event. This conference was titled China, Forced Organ Harvesting and the Chinese Communist Party. It is hard to imagine that a government would be actively involved in organizing the means and even the infrastructure where prisoners of conscience are systematically blood tested, tissue typed, and then channeled into the transplant hospital system as a living data bank for donor organs. But over the years, it has become clear that this is exactly what is happening in China. Among those who have been victimized are Tibetans and even house Christians. Uyghur Muslims, of course, in Xinjiang are said to be targeted as well. As we speak, over 1 million Uyghur Muslims are detained in prison camps in the Xinjiang region. But this terrible crime did not start recently. Organ harvesting has been going on for over 2 decades in China. And initial research made clear that the sharp increase in organ transplants, which took off in the early 2000s, went suspiciously hand in hand with the timeline of the persecution of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice heavily persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party since July 1999. We have an impressive panel of experts lined up for you here today, and so we will be able to discuss this issue in great detail. We will hear international human rights lawyer David Matas, former Vice President of the European Parliament, Mr. Edmund Macmillan Scott. We have Mr. Peter van Dalen, member of the European Parliament, Mr. Hamid Sabi, counsel to the China Tribunal, Ms. Cayenne Wong, President of the Falun Dafa Association in Holland. On my right, Dr. Harold King. We have Ms. Manel Msalmi, who is the President of the European Association for the Defense of Minorities. And on my far left, Mr. Andy Vermaud of AIDL. Okay, so in 2013, the European Parliament has adopted a resolution condemning organ harvesting in China, thereby raising the alarm bell while asking the EU as well as each EU member state to act. But in the EU, as well as at the federal level of each EU member state, we can see that no one seems to be willing to play the David against this Goliath. We are honored to have with us as our first speaker, Mr. Peter van Dalen. He is a member of the European Parliament as a member of the European People's Party. Mr. van Dalen is also a member of the European Parliament's Subcommittee on Human Rights. Mr. van Dalen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benens. Thank you very much for hosting this important event. I have a busy schedule today, but I managed to find 1 hour to participate because I really think this is an utmost important topic you present to us today. And I'm very honored with all the colleagues speaking today, in particular Edward Macmillan Scott, my former colleague, and also Mr. Hamid Sabi, representing the China Tribunal Council as counselor. I really think that's important that we have those speakers amongst the others. And in particular, I want to thank them for also participating. Well, as you rightly stated, the Parliament adopted on the 12th of December 2013 a resolution condemning the organ harvesting in China. But since then, the situation is under the table, is silent. And I fear it has to do with geopolitical reasons. China is becoming, or is already, one of the major world powers. And I'm afraid that here in Europe, we do not want to attack China on sensitive issues like organ harvesting. But I really think we should, because organ harvesting is really a very blunt attack on basic human rights. And not only an attack on those human rights, but also when you know that many of the victims are prisoners or from minorities like the Falun Gong or the Uyghur or other minorities, it's really very bad attack of China, of the party in China on those people. It's a rape of human rights. I would like to focus on some issues on my behalf, representing the European Parliament. What could the EU do? As you rightly stated, we have the resolution, but since then it's silent. First of all, we have many relations as European Union with China. And for me, it's too much talking about trade, about money, and not enough about human rights and the rights of minorities. It's too much the merchant and too little the pastor. And I really would like to have that we have now put on hold the investment agreement between the EU and China. I think that's a good thing. We should use this as a whipstick to make clear to China that the violation of human rights is important. And as you know, actions speak louder than words, and this whipstick is part of that. And I really think we should keep it on hold until the moment that China really makes serious business of human rights. And one of those rights is the integrity of the body and, well, not this organ harvesting, which is a clear violation of every human right you can imagine. That's one. Two, I think it's also important that the member states themselves keep a keen eye on what's happening in China. In many member states, we have business professionals, but also medical professionals who work with China. And I hope the member states make them aware of this organ harvesting practice in China, and that those professionals, both business professionals and medical professionals, keep their eyes and ears open, and that they spot what is going on in China. And thirdly, the European Parliament. Well, let me tell you, it was silent since 2013, but since I'm convinced also by the work of the China Tribunal that this should be on the agenda of the European Parliament, I'm fighting an uphill battle to get this issue, this very grave and serious issue of organ harvesting, back on the European agenda. And it seems my uphill battle might come to a victory, because I was promised by the secretary of the Human Rights Committee, the Droit Committee, as you already mentioned, that we will have, on my request, a hearing on the organ harvesting in China in one of the coming months, maybe December or the first quarter of the next year. So it was really a battle, but I had to push, and I did find some other people to support me, especially in my own political group, the EPP. So I expect that we can achieve to have this hearing, because I want this issue back on the agenda. Since 2013, it was silence all over the place. That's impossible when you face the atrocities in this organ harvesting practices in China. So, Mr. Chairman, from my side, those remarks, and the most important one is to get this very grave and serious and bad issue back on the European agenda, and that we push China to have it in a more serious treatment there, because China is silent, of course. They always say, no, nothing is happening, you're absolutely wrong, no problems at all, it's almost paradise here. It is not, of course. So that's why I'm fighting with you the battle to have this on the agenda and to expose once more these grave atrocities of human rights committed in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Peter van Dalen. We hope to hear more good news from the European Parliament, as you mentioned. This is definitely a good thing if that would be possible to get a follow-up on the resolution that has already been achieved. Our next speaker is on my right, Ms. Kayan Wong. Kayan Wong is the president and spokesperson of the Falun Gong Association in Holland. Investigative reports like the Bloody Harvest report published by David Kilgore and David Matas in 2006 revealed how Falun Gong became the first and the main target for organ harvesting in China. But many people in the West don't really know what Falun Gong is. Kayan Wong will explain to us what Falun Gong is all about and how it became an enemy of the state in China and a target for violent suppression. Kayan Wong, you have the floor.
Thank you. Many of you know about what's happening with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but indeed, not that many people know that the peaceful meditation group of people who practice Falun Gong are being inhumanly killed for their organs in China. And we are talking about a state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting on large scale. So what is Falun Gong and why are they the targets? I would like to show you a short introduction video about Falun Gong.
Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, is an advanced self-cultivation practice that improves mental and physical wellness through physical exercises and the development of one's character. In China, cultivation practices have a history of thousands of years and form the spiritual foundation of Chinese civilization. In 1992, Falun Dafa was introduced to the public by Master Li Hongzhi. The practice quickly spread because of its profound principles and proven health benefits. By 1999, with over 100 million practitioners, Falun Dafa had grown to become the largest practice of its kind in China and around the world.
So for many in the Western society, it's very hard to comprehend why a practice based on the principles like truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance is being persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. And they often ask the question, if Falun Gong is about upholding these moral principles, then why is it persecuted by the CCP? The reason lays within its popularity. As you've seen before, at the end of the 90s, there were about 70 to 100 million people in China who practice Falun Gong. And at the same time, there are about 60 to 70 million active members within the CCP. And in the eyes of the former Communist Party leader Jiang Zemin, Falun Gong became more popular than the communism in China. There is a Chinese saying, it says, envy leads to jealousy, and jealousy leads to hatred. And this phrase illustrates very accurately the attitude of Jiang toward Falun Gong. So he ordered a crackdown, which started on July 20, 1999. And from that date on, it is illegal and forbidden to practice Falun Gong in China. But so many people had benefited from this practice in terms of their health or inner peace. They didn't want to give it up just like that. So that's the reason why the ban very quickly escalated into a ruthless persecution in China. There were high arrests were done, People ended up in prisons or labor camps where they were tortured. Mass detention, what we've seen happening with the Uyghurs today in Xinjiang, also happened with Falun Gong in China back in the days. But Falun Gong, at one point, there is estimate that 2/3 of all prisoners in China were prisoners of conscience, and most of them are Falun Gong practitioners. Can you imagine how many families were broken by this persecution and how many kids became orphans? I know Ms. Zhang, she is also here present today. Her husband was told by the Chinese authority to divorce from her or else he will lose his job. So they divorced. And when she was sentenced for 7 years imprisonment, her daughter was left alone with the grandparents, and she grew up without the care and love of father and mother. For those who have been born and raised up in a free society, it's very hard to understand how it is to live under communism. We understand when we are told not to say this or that thing, or when we are told not to do this or that thing. But under communist China, we are ordered not to think this and that. And this makes the story of the persecution even more difficult to understand. And this became even worse when the CCP started its huge propaganda machinery to further demonize Falun Gong. And they also openly started to calling it a dangerous cult. It has a huge impact, not only in China, where people were told to hate Falun Gong, but it has also a huge impact on the international community on the way how they handled this issue and gave support. Recently, the French Military School Strategic Research Institute, the IRSEM, which is an organization under the French Ministry of Armed Forces, published a report. It details the CCP infiltration and mass influence of international governments and how they control others through overseas Chinese, the media, politics, education, economy, diplomacy, think tanks, and culture. It also highlighted 79 instances of the CCP persecution of Falun Gong, and it gave concrete examples how the CCP bought off the overseas Chinese media and Chinese companies to spread fake information against Falun Gong and incited hatred, which demonized Falun Gong. Actually, it's very strange that the cult label is used because in the early 90s, the government even praised Falun Gong and they are rewarded for several times. And when the persecution started, this word was not used. The official reason given for the persecution was that it had disrupted the public order and traffic. Okay, so doing slow-moving exercises in parks with beautiful Chinese music is disrupting the traffic and disrupting the order. Okay, it doesn't make sense at all. And it was around half a year after the persecution started that Jiang Zemin first used this cult word to further intensify the persecution of Falun Gong. And all state-run media, they started to immediately pick up this label. And this turned out to be very tragic. And especially when two Canadian researchers, David Gilgore and David Matas, has published a report in 2006 called Bloody Harvests, the killing of Falun Gong for their organs. It indicates that from early 2000 on, the CCP has already started using detained Falun Gong practitioners for organ harvesting. And in the conclusion of the independent China Tribunal, it stated that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and properly the main source of organ supply, and that forced organ harvesting continues till today. The Chinese propaganda and disinformation throughout the years has been a great stumbling block for the international community to engage in this topic. The CCP has been deceiving the world for many years, arresting and detaining innocent people who are just trying to upholding the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and at the same time using them as the living data bank for donor organs is what many experts called a crime against humanity. After the Holocaust, it was said, never again, never ever, but it's still happening in the communist-ruled China. The COVID-19 pandemic has been terrible for the whole world. But if I can add one positive note to it, it's that this pandemic, along with what's happened in Hong Kong and other things, it lets us see the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And everyone knows that the CCP is evil. And do we also know how evil they are? I'm very thankful and honored to be here to speak to you about this human rights tragedy in China. And I would like to thank the organizers for their great efforts and commitment. And thank you all for your attention in this topic. And I think this event is very important, yes, and it can make a real change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kayan Wong. I think you already touched a number of core issues, not only in terms of the persecution of Falun Gong, but also in regards to the issue of organ harvesting itself, definitely. As our next speaker, initially we announced Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, the president of the China Tribunal. The China Tribunal is an independent, non-governmental people's tribunal to inquire into forced organ harvesting in China. It was held in London from late 2018 until early 2019. The publication of the final judgment of the tribunal has had a significant impact on the international community. Unfortunately, Sir Geoffrey Nice had to cancel at the very last moment, but we are very honored to have with us today Mr. Hamid Sabi, who was the counsel for the tribunal. Mr. Sabi will give a presentation on the tribunal's process and a summary on its findings. Mr. Sabi, whenever you are ready.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. And on behalf of Sir Geoffrey Nice, I offer his apologies for not being able to attend because of a close friend of him that passed away, and this morning it's the funeral. I appreciate the invitation and would like to address the issues that have been raised before this panel. My position as counsel to the tribunal was to collect and present the evidence to the tribunal. In total, over 6 hearing days, we submitted thousands of pages of documents and 55 witnesses, half of it being fact witnesses, and the rest were expert, including the investigators, Mr. Mattis, Mr. Kelker, Ethan Goodman, and the others who have worked so hard to establish the facts of the treatment of Falun Gong. All the panel members served on a pro bono basis. Apart from a professor of Chinese studies, the rest of them were totally unaware of the Falun Gong practices, and through this tribunal were informed of how Falun Gong had been formed and how they had been, over the last 2 decades, been tortured and dehumanized by the Chinese government. So the tribunal was entirely independent of Falun Gong and had no connection to this movement. The findings of the tribunal are amazing in the sense that it is beyond reasonable doubt that the tribunal had concluded that the practice of forced organ harvesting had been going on for many years in China. There is no question that the Chinese used prisoners' organs for organ harvesting. They admitted that until 2010, they were using death row prisoners' organs for organ harvesting and sold it to organ tourists. So and then they passed a law to stop that practice. So there is an admission that this practice was going on from early days of organ harvest, of organ transplant in China. What has changed is that, first of all, there was a law in China to make sure that if somebody is condemned to death, within 7 days, the execution will be carried out. So that left very limited time to match the donor with the patient. Secondly, most of the death row prisoners who were condemned to death were drug addicts and involved with drugs, and most of them not healthy enough to provide an organ. The third issue is that the number of organs that were harvested or that was transplanted in China exceeded substantially the number of death row prisoners. So from 2003, 2004, there must have been a new source for this massive expansion of the industry. The figures and the hospital shows that China's infrastructure for transplant substantially increased in early 2000, surpassing United States at some stage in late 2010s. There is a dispute between Chinese apologists and investigators like David Mattis and Nathan Goodman and David Kilger as to the number of transplants. They claim between 60,000 to 100,000 transplants had been occurring in China every year. China admits that it was between 10 to 16,000 transplants. Yet they have to prove where these transplants took place and how the sources of these organs are. In Western Europe and the United States, it's very clear. Every single transplant is documented, the consent of the donor, the circumstances under which the transplant had occurred. They're all documented. And if somebody wants to check that, they should be able to do that. The Chinese government, under the pressure from the European institutions, also brought in the so-called witness, which is the Chinese Red Cross. Chinese Red Cross has got nothing to do with the International Red Cross Committee. It's an internal Chinese Communist Party organ, so they will certify anything that the Chinese government would tell them to certify. And then China tried to create an organ donor database. At most in 2016, they claimed they had 375,000 donors registered. Under no circumstances, 375,000 registered donor can produce the number of organs that China is claiming. The number of the people who die every year out of these donors who are in a position to donate an organ is very limited. China claims that they have got 2.8 organs from every donor that had passed away to reach to the point of 10,000 organ transplant. This is 180 times of what is achieved in Europe and the United States. It is impossible to make sure that for every single donor, registered donor that dies, he can extract 2.8 organs out. The evidence from the camp survivors of Falun Gong showed that a substantial amount of blood was drawn every 3 months. Every 3 months, all the prisoners were medically tested. Their organs were checked by ultrasound and other means. They did not receive any result of their investigation. In Uyghur Tribunal, where I happened to be the counsel as well under the chairmanship of Sir Geoffrey Nice, one of the witnesses who was a teacher in the camp confirmed that whenever the prisoners were taken to be tested, the result came back, but not to the prisoners, but to the camp commanders, and some of them were marked with a different color. Those who were marked with a different color disappeared in a very short period of time. So the suggestion from her evidence was that these were the ones who were taken for organ harvesting. The tribunal in its judgment concluded that organ harvesting has been, which I suggest that everybody would get a copy of this judgment, which is available on Amazon, that organ harvesting has been going on for the last 2 decades in China, forced organ harvesting. And the Falun Gong practitioners, as well as Uyghurs and probably other ethnic groups and different religions like Tibetan and as Christians, had been used for this practice. China could have simply opened its doors and proved that all this is wrong and just a fiction and something that Mr. Matters and the others had created. They don't do that. I have written at least 30 letters to the Chinese authorities, Chinese physicians who were involved, inviting them to come and give evidence. Not a single one responded. I have asked the Transplantation Society, Istanbul Declaration, who regulate transplantation, to come and explain why they support China, and they have refused to do that. The main problem with the issue of Falun Gong and the organ harvesting is that China has its apologists among top practitioners of organ harvesting. They dominate the Transplantation Society, and although some members had declared that they are not really supportive of what the organization is doing, but the fact that this organization has not come out clearly condemning China for its practices and for its shadowy and secret keeping of the records, that had allowed China to escape public condemnation. So, but you can see, as your previous speaker said, that people sympathize with Uyghurs very easily because they recognize their existence, and there is no China apologist in the Western world to support China's position. The same thing did not happen for the Falun Gong practitioners. They did not manage to silence the apologists, although thanks to the efforts of investigators and groups like ETAC and your organization, they had been exposed, but they still present China with on behalf of China, an alternative theory as to why this story is not true. And my suggestion is that the pressure has to be brought to bear on professional organizations that still deal with China, including the Transplantation Society and Istanbul Declaration. They should put their mind at rest that the practice that has been going on cannot be tolerated. They did not condemn China when they were using death row prisoners and forcibly took their organs. And they did not condemn them when they did that to Falun Gong practitioners. Thank you. I think I've used my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sabi, and thank you for your very late minute confirmation to attend this conference. It was a great honor to have you here with us today. Okay, as our next speaker, we have with us here on my right hand side, Dr. Harold King, who is a Deputy Director of DAFO, which stands for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, an NGO specifically established to combat the organ harvesting issue, particularly concerning the situation in China. Dr. King, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Could I have my first slide? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Vermouth and Mr. Cartwright, for inviting Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting to speak today. DAFO is a non-profit organization founded by medical doctors in 2006, following the announcement by Epoch Times that forced organ harvesting was occurring in China. DAFO has been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016 and 2017, and honored with the Mother Teresa Award for Social Justice in 2019. DAFO provides the medical community and society with objective findings of unethical and illegal organ harvesting while promoting and protecting ethical standards to preserve human dignity. Could I have the second slide? Thank you. This meeting comes at a critical time for Europe and the world. Europe, and indeed every single state, world state, are at a crossroads that will determine their very future. However, I am not talking about the pandemic, but the destruction of Europe's traditional heritage. From its birthplace in ancient Greece to the modern day, ethics have influenced conduct and behavior in European societies. The Hippocratic Oath is the guiding principle for the medical profession, and businesses integrate corporate ethics. Consensus on ethical values has shaped the basic rights of the people and laid the foundation for peace and prosperity throughout the European continent. But these values by which we live are being put to the test. Forced organ harvesting of living people, specifically aimed at the eradication of Falun Gong practitioners and other minorities in China, threatens democracies everywhere, as it violates universally held principles of how societies need to function successfully. It also turns the medical and nursing profession into an abusive practice. Next slide. So why do we single out China? Sorry, next slide as well. This article, the Ambassador et al. Article published in the American Journal of Transplants in 2016 indicates that 2/3 of the transplant tourists documented in medical articles are going to China. I don't know if you can see, but that's more than three times more than those that go to India. So it's substantially more important. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this may look like a complicated slide. What I want you to concentrate on is more the shape of the curve rather than everything. You can see a gradual, steady increase. Could you pass on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the first slide was the total number of transplants done by all the countries in the world. And this curve is France from the year 2000 to 2018. And again, we can see this steady increase, which is the curve that relates to normal transplant that is dependent on organs. Yeah, we can, over the years, we've improved our techniques to be able to obtain more and more organs from accident people, brain dead people, cardiac dead people. But this increase is only 3 to 5% every year. It's a very small increase. Next slide, please. This is China's curve, which, as you can see, looks more like a roller coaster ride than a normal gradual increase. What is really surprising is our previous speakers have already spoken about this, is the very rapid increase up into, well, on this figure, it's 2004. And then for some strange reason, this marvelous increase in transplants suddenly stops and reduces. So what happened to all these organ sources? Then there's a period of 10 years where it stays low. And again, no real explanation for why suddenly there's this loss in organs. And then back in 2015, it suddenly goes up again. And actually at the moment, China has actually achieved, or at least published, over 25,000 transplants last year. For me, this is an ideological based curve. We can see that in 2006, there's the publication of the Bloody Harvest Report. In 2008, there's the Olympics, China Olympics. That had a great effect on transplants. There's also the European resolution in 2013 that had a very strong effect on the whole world. Everybody was surprised and supported this resolution, and the Chinese transplant industry had to suddenly realize that there was a lot of pressure on it. And what is even more surprising, because in 2015, and it was because of the European resolution and the pressure that all the doctors had put onto China, that the Chinese transplant industry suddenly decided to say, right, we're going to change. We have nothing but donors, not voluntary donors. And when we would have imagined the curve to go down, because after 5,000 years, the Chinese or the Asian people do not really agree with giving their organs, so it should have gone down, and instead it's going up. This is a very particular curve, and for me represents exactly that it's ideology and the need to hide what they're actually doing is what's hidden in this graph. Okay, next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Ah, okay. It's temperamental. So these figures, while we're waiting for the next slide, is they're from the Global Observatory of Transplants, Donations and Transplants organized by the WHO. And in the next slide, we will be seeing a message from the English government saying that in 2019, they discovered that the World Health Organization had no means of verifying these figures. They do not do any investigations. They do not go to China to determine the reality of the figures that we can see here or any other claims that the Chinese government may have. I'll try and continue while we're waiting for the next slide. Okay. Yes, well, the next slides were more graphic slides on the information about how, well, I can talk about it with this graphic. This is very good. This flat part shows that for 10 years, there were 10,000 transplants per year, so-called, that is what the Chinese government told us. However, research from the WOIPFG, the report from the new Bloody Harvest report showed that during this 10-year period of stability, the number of hospitals involved in transplantation were increasing. They were developing, becoming bigger, having bigger number of beds available. So obviously the number of transplants were rising. Why would investors invest money into a hospital if transplants were, on the contrary, very low and not financially interesting? Another graphic that I would have shown is the fact that the rising parts on this curve, when when it's analyzed, and this was analyzed back in 2019 by Robinson, Hind, and Levy, indicated that this curve was, as Mr. Sabi mentioned, incredibly regular. There's 2.8 organs from every donor in China, but also it was too good to be true. And we noticed in one of the graphics that I would have showed you that the figures have been tricked. On one single night, on the 31st of December, the numbers of donors, organ donors increased, sorry, the number of people who want to donate organs increased by exactly 25,000 on that one night. And the year later, it increased exactly by, or a little bit more than 88,000. So you have a curve, instead of generally slowly increasing, just goes up, becomes flat, and then goes up again. This research article proved that these figures were completely false. Well, I think we're still battling with the slides, so I'll continue like that. I would also like to mention the report from the French. So it's a think tank that's part of the French Defense, Ministry of Defense, and because they did mention organ harvesting in their report, and they were saying how China has been manipulating the narrative on organ harvesting and organ transplantation, organ donation throughout the world, so that it could hide what it's actually doing, and continue to manipulate the figures, continue to hide what they're doing, and to allow the organ harvesting industry in China to continue. This report, as Kayan mentioned, very important, because it is the first time the French government anyway has spoken so outspokenly against the Chinese government in describing how it's completely infiltrated France. A second report that came out was from the French senator, Mr. Gatolin, André Gatolin, who again was observing the infiltration of the Chinese government in the French universities. This is a very big problem, and there was an interesting, I wish I could show you the slide, but a very interesting objective of this report was saying that we could, at a French but also European and maybe even a world level, determine a new scale to compare different universities based on human rights, ethics, and not purely on number of students or finances, as the Shanghai rating is actually based. We seem to be out of my slides. Doesn't matter. I'll continue. As I said, forced organ harvesters, of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, we try to defend these ethical values. And last month we were really honored to be able to participate with 4 other NGOs that I would have shown you the names, that are from France. That is CAP, the president is here today, Monsieur Terrival. So he's president of CAP Freedom of Conscience. Thank you very much. Another NGO that's from Japan called the TTRA. A third one from Taiwan called Taiko. And the fourth one called KAOET, which is from South Korea. And all of these NGOs have been fighting for over 15 years, just like us, to defend the ethical values of medicine, but also denounce what the Chinese Communist Party is doing and influencing everyone. So we all organized together a World Summit. We had 38 speakers from 4 continents, from 19 different countries, and they covered different subjects like medical, legal, political aspects of organ harvesting, but also how media have played their role and how this affects our society today. Oh, well, I would have had the possibility to show you the different speakers, or some of the different speakers anyway, so that we could have seen the richness of these speeches. Let me just see if I can say. Well, I think I'll have to finish quite soon, so because my slides aren't coming back. At the end of this World Summit, so it's a World Summit on combating and preventing forced organ harvesting, the 5 NGOs announced the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. This is an international document where of the people of the 21st century proclaim their determination to stop the most diabolical atrocity of forced organ harvesting by the Chinese Communist Party. It builds its foundation on unalienable rights which cannot be deprived by any person or regime, and lays bare the core principles to the universal values, including the inviolability of human dignity and the fundamental protection of human life, body, and freedom. This Universal Declaration proposes measures to combat and prevent forced organ harvesting from gravely violating human values. I would have showed you that this this Universal Declaration was supported by over 120 MEPs, MPs, professors, doctors, other specialists and experts from around the world, just to show you the importance of and the awareness that people have on these terrible crimes. I invite, obviously, the European Parliament to maybe look into this resolution so that we can maybe work together, all the MEPs, as well as all the local MPs in all the European states, and use this document as a means to propose a strong front against the organ harvesting and all the other human rights abuses that occur in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Harold King. Our apologies for the technical difficulties that we've had during your presentation. I'm sure people will be able to find more information, I assume, about the world's on the website of DAFO itself. Definitely take a look. And thank you for coming all the way from Paris to Brussels to attend in person here today. Thank you for your great effort. To introduce our next speaker, I'd like to refer back to what I said early on about governments not engaging in the role of a David against this Goliath. Because actually, for many years already, there is a David going against this Goliath. And as a matter of fact, there are 2 of them. It was Canadian human rights lawyer David Matas and former Canadian Parliament's member David Kilgour who initially started researching these allegations into organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in China. After advertisements were found on websites of both military and civilian hospitals in China, basically saying that anyone who is in urgent need for a donor organ can come to China, and you will be able to receive any organ within a delivery time of 10 days up to 3 weeks after the arrival. This extremely short delivery time sounded very suspicious. Take note at this time, China didn't even have an organ donation program. So Mr. Matas and Mr. Kilgour started an investigation which resulted into the very first report that was published in 2006 on this topic of organ harvesting. The title of the report was Bloody Harvest, the Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs. After the publication of their report, David Matas and David Kilgour started traveling around the world, and they have been doing so ever since, trying to raise awareness on this, this issue and this terrible crime. Unfortunately, Mr. Kilgour and Mr. Matas could not join us directly today, but Mr. David Matas has sent us a pre-recorded video statement, especially for this conference, and so we are very honored that he can share his expertise on this topic in this way. Very recently, in June of this year, a group of United Nations rapporteurs and human rights experts have indicated that in one of their reports that they are and I quote, extremely alarmed by organ harvesting allegations, end of quote. The experts said that they have received credible information from detainees from ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, among whose are the Uyghurs, Tibetans, House Christians, and of course, Falun Gong practitioners who are systematically victimized. In itself, this announcement by the United Nations rapporteur is very good news. It's great news, actually. However, the Bloody Harvest report exposing this terrible crime was already published in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. David Matas. Yes. Okay, we'll come back to Mr. Matas later. No problem. Okay, then we'll go immediately to our next speaker. And actually, I am very honored to introduce this next speaker. Mr. Edmund McMillan Scott is former Vice President of the European Parliament. And during his time at the European Parliament, he was always has been very much in the forefront when it comes to putting the issue of organ harvesting, as well as the issue of the persecution of Falun Gong in China on the agenda. Mr. McMillan Scott has taken the initiative to even meet in person several Falun Gong practitioners in China, as well as human rights advocates like the famous Chinese lawyer Gao Sichen. Mr. McMillan Scott, even though it's through a Zoom conference call, it's a great honor to have you again here with us in Brussels, and to say it in the way that I always heard you announce your speakers, which is a line that I have to admit I have a little bit stolen from you. You have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for this important conference, and thank you to those who are attending or watching in. I was elected European Parliament Vice President in 2004 and held the Human Rights and Democracy portfolio until I left the European Parliament in 2014. And from 1997, I'd worked on the EU-China strategy, which was a commercial trade arrangement, and visited China frequently between 1997 and 2006. In 2006, aware of the mounting concern about the persecution of Falun Gong by the Chinese Communist Party, I visited Beijing and encountered various individuals, including a former prisoner, who told me that he had been in the prison hospital where he saw the body of his buddy, a cadaver, with holes where apparently body parts had been removed. And this was the first indication to me personally, in evidence, that this heinous crime was taking place. I also encountered, as you said, Gao Sichen, who had in 2005 investigated the persecution of Falun Gong. He's a Chinese human rights lawyer, Christian, and unfortunately he was arrested later that year and went through various imprisonments and has now disappeared. But nevertheless, the international community has been waking up to the persecution of Falun Gong, and more recently, the Uyghurs and Tibetans. I have met hundreds of Falun Gong former prisoners who've gone through the normal 3 years of torture to get them to recant their practice. But many, many, many thousands, estimated by the China Tribunal, to which I gave evidence in 2018-19, between 60 and 90,000 individual Falun Gong prisoners were being murdered each year for their body parts. There is mounting evidence that this constitutes genocide. The China Tribunal, which was led by Jeffrey Nice, and Hamid Sami gave evidence to it, didn't find a finding of genocide, but indicated that it was highly likely. It did find crimes against humanity, in particular in respect of Falun Gong and Uyghur prisoners. And more recently, the China Tribunal, which is ongoing and will produce its final finding in December. The tribunals will be meeting in London, again under Jeffrey Nice, and heard evidence from, for example, my colleague Charles Parton, a former EU diplomat and British diplomat in Beijing. And he gave evidence as to the credibility that the most senior individual in China, Xi Jinping, must have ordered the persecution of the Uyghur population, which includes organ harvesting. And that chain of command is a very important thing in determining genocide. So we hope that in December, finally we'll have a finding which is critical for world public opinion in placing the responsibility directly with the Chinese leadership. During my time in the European Parliament, contrary to my old friend Peter van Dalen's current experience, the European Parliament was very active in multiple hearings, resolutions, especially on Falun Gong, and more recently on the Uyghurs too. And of course, that culminated in the 2013 resolution, which has already been referred to. We also engineered a political boycott of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. No senior EU official attended, and indeed many other personalities from the European Union failed to turn up. I would like to see a political boycott of the Winter Olympics to take place in Beijing between the 4th and 20th of February 2022. And I think that would draw attention to world opinion on the persecution of these minorities, but in particular, the crime of genocide against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong, and other sects within China. Thank you.
Okay, we're back. The technical issue with David Mehta's speech will be solved very soon. So for our next speaker, we'll go to Manel Salmi. She is researcher and environmental humanities and American studies, and also the president of the European Association for the Defense of Minorities. Ms. Salmi, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming here today to support the Falun Gong community. I'm honored today to be here and to share with you this issue and to share with you the persecution and the human rights violation of this community. So my speech is entitled Falun Gong Persecution and Organ Harvest. Millions of innocent people in China lost their jobs, dropped from school, were jailed, tortured, or killed simply for practicing their own religion. For these people, practicing their own religion today in China is really dangerous because we can get rid of you by the Chinese authorities. You can be jailed, you can be tortured, or worse, millions are detained or imprisoned. For several people in China, the basic reality of the campaign against Falun Gong has been long periods of detention, between quotation marks, reform through labor camps or prisons. China's Gulag system, after farcical or non-existent trials, others are held in detention centers, or what we call black jails, which is a network of extra-legal detention centers within China. Detainees are forced to work up to 20 hours per day, producing without pay toys, Christmas tree lights, soccer balls, etc. for exports. Those who refuse are tortured or are arbitrarily detained. The widespread detention and imprisonment of Falun Gong practitioners has been reported by the World Health Organization, the US Department of State, Amnesty International, and plenty of other Western media. There is a kind of brainwashing, or what we call transformation, in camps, jails, or in special re-education centers. Detained practitioners are forced to undergo what can only be described as brainwashing. The Chinese Communist Party goal is to force these people to renounce to their spiritual beliefs or to look at their religious belonging as dangerous, and also to be exposed to this kind of psychological persecution, or what we call brainwashing. The key ingredient of this brainwashing process or transformation is sleep deprivation, hours on gazing videos, threats, Cultural Revolution style, struggle sessions, etc. But stubborn individuals who refuse to follow these instructions are injected with psychotropic drugs in asylums as treatment for the mental disturbance of incorrect political thinking. Since early 2000, the use of torture on detainees has been widely documented by major media, human rights organizations, and also international human rights organizations. There are a minimum of 100,000 cases of torture documented by Mengu organization, and reason to believe that these numbers are true, and sometimes several times higher. Common torture techniques include shocking with electrical batons, burning with iron, trying the body in painful position, rape and sexual torture of women belonging to the Falun Gong community in detention, and also organ harvesting. The party's ultimate solution for the vast number of incarcerated front adherents, however, is far more terrifying. Estimates from multiple separate independent reports indicate that there are thousands of people from the Falun Gong community who are killed, or killed so as to extract their vital organs, which becomes a huge transplantation business in China. Livers, kidneys, hearts, and cornea are off from the living, anesthetized social movement adherents with matching blood types, and sold to party officials and other desperate yet wealthy individuals from China and abroad. Undercover investigators' phone calls to China hospitals have caught doctors boasting about this practice on tape. In June 2021, UN independent experts expressed their concerns at allegations of organ harvesting on minority groups, including Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Muslims, and Christians in detention in China. Consistent with the statements, the experts, including Mr. Fernand de Varenne, Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Mr. Ahmed Shahid, Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Faith or Belief, Ms. Niles Melzer, Special Rapporteur on Torture and other and human degrading treatment or punishment, revived, I quote, credible information that detainees from ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities could also be forcibly subjected to blood tests and organ examinations like ultrasound and X-rays without their informed consent, while other prisoners aren't required to undergo such examinations. The results of the examinations are reportedly registered in an exceedingly database of living organ sources that facilitates organ allocation. End of quote. In March 2020, a report by the NGO Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, DAFO, which we have the honor to have the president here, on the forcible removal of organ in China and its global implications, denounced forced organ harvesting as an aberrant, murderous practice by the Chinese Communist regime. In EU parliamentary question written in December 2020, a report by Doctors Without Boundaries mentioned that forcible harvesting of organs from prisoners has been permitted in China since 1984. The Chinese political party began persecuting followers of Falun Gong in 1999. Since then, the annual number of organ transplants in China has risen by 300. It's estimated that over 60,000 transplant operations happen each year. The World Health Organization should worry about the organ transplants in China and check if these organs are forcibly harvested or not. Human rights activists and health experts are questioning the WHO stance regarding China's donation program. And despite the demands of human rights and health organizations, we still wait for this inspection to happen against any criminal activity behind organ harvest or donation in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Salmi. So we will come back now to Mr. David Matas. All technical issues seem to have been resolved. Like I said earlier, he will have a video. He has sent us a video statement, and we'll show that to you now. In his video, Mr. David Matas will elaborate further on the role that the United Nations has or has not played over the years regarding organ harvesting on prisoners of conscience in China.
I want to talk today about how the United Nations has addressed and not addressed the mass killing of Falun Gong and other prisoners of conscience for their organs. The United Nations is a sprawling, multifaceted institution. Its various components do not necessarily act in a coordinated way. That is certainly true of the industrialized killing in China of prisoners of conscience for their organs. I intend to go through various structures of the United Nations which have both addressed this crime against humanity and have avoided addressing it. First of all, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture. The UN Rapporteur on Torture, Manfred Noack, in 2007, in his annual report to the Human Rights Council, asked China to explain the discrepancy between the volume of transplants and the volume of identified sources. According to official Chinese public reports, there were approximately 30,000 transplants before 1999. Professor Shi Bingyi, vice chair of the China Medical Organ Transplant Association, said in March 2006 that China had done about 90,000 transplants up to the end of 2005. That meant there were about 60,000 transplants in the 6-year period 2000 to 2005, or about 10,000 a year since the persecution of Falun Gong began, a figure to which UN Rapporteur Noack referred. The government of China did not address the concerns raised by Rapporteur Noack in his 2007 report. As a result, the rapporteur reiterated his concerns in 2008. The Chinese government, in a response to the second request, stated Professor Shi Bingyi, who was the source of the 90,000 figure, expressly clarified that on no occasion had he made such a statement or given figures of this kind, and these allegations, so said the Chinese government, and the related figures are pure fabrication. Moreover, the government of China, lest there be any doubt about their position, asserted that China's annual health statistics are compiled on the basis of categories of health disorder and not in accordance with the various types of treatment provided. Yet that official statement of Xi Bingyi, which the government claims was never made, was accessible on the internet at the time of their response and remains accessible on the internet still today through the Wayback Machine archive. 2. The United Nations Rapporteur on Religious Intolerance. The then UN Rapporteur on Religious Intolerance, Asma Jahangir, in 2007 and 2008 acted in tandem with the Rapporteur on Torture. She raised the same concerns as the Rapporteur on Torture had raised and got the same response. 3. The UN Committee Against Torture. China is a party to the Convention Against Torture. As a party, it is obligated to report periodically to the expert committee established under the Convention. The Convention empowers the expert committee to make concluding observations on those reports. China has reported twice in 2008 and 2015 since it began the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs. The UN Committee Against Torture in November 2008 wrote, "The committee expresses its concern about the failure of the government of China to explain the discrepancy in the number of transplants between the years 2000 to 2005 and the numbers of identifiable sources of organs. Despite repeated requests from the UN Rapporteur on Torture, the UN Rapporteur on Religious Intolerance, and the committee for an explanation." In both its 2008 and 2015 report, the committee, in its concluding observations, called on China to immediately conduct or commission an independent investigation into organ transplant abuse in China with prisoner of conscience victims. 4, the Universal Periodic Review of the UN Human Rights Council. When China came up for scrutiny under the Universal Periodic Review in February 2009, many states spoke out for the foundational rights, the respect for which would have made the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs impossible. These efforts were fruitless. States recommended that China guarantee all citizens the exercise of religious freedom, freedom of belief, and freedom of worshipping in private, that China abolish all forms of arbitrary detention, that China implement the recommendations of the UN Committee Against Torture, and that China take effective measures to ensure that lawyers can defend their clients without fear of harassment. The government of China said explicitly, recommendation by recommendation, that it would not accept these recommendations. These recommendations were repeated in the Universal Periodic Review for 2013. The Chinese government responded by saying, "The best person to know the human rights situation in China is a Chinese person." Yet, a Chinese person in China who repeated what rights-respecting states said about China during the Universal Periodic Review would lose his or her job, be arbitrarily detained, be tortured into recanting, and failing recantation, disappear. As Chinese human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng said, "You cannot be a human rights advocate in China without becoming a human rights victim yourself." In the 2018 Universal Periodic Review for China, the Chinese delegation, in response to questions about organ harvesting, stated that the transplantation of organs is regulated by strict provisions enacted in 2015, that China has an organ allocation system, and that the traceability of organs in China was affirmed by the World Health Organization. Yet there was no law enacted in China about transplantation of organs in 2015, only a Chinese Communist Party Government of China policy statement. The organ allocation system, the China Organ Transplant Registry, is shrouded in secrecy. A link to its website shows nothing substantial. The World Health Organization does not engage in periodic public independent evaluations and critiques of country transplantation systems, either for China or for any other country. 5th, the United Nations Human Rights Council. The UN Human Rights Council has 3 regular sessions a year, typically in March for 4 weeks, June for 3 weeks, and September for 3 weeks. At each session, there's an agenda item titled Human Rights Situations Which Require the Council's Attention. Not being a member of the Council prevents a state from voting at the Council, but not from speaking at the Council. organ transplant abuse in China with prisoner of conscience victims has not to date been drawn to the attention of Human Rights Council sessions, but it could and should be. Number 6, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was presented in December 2013 with a petition which had nearly 1.5 million signatures from 53 countries and regions asking the High Commissioner to call upon the government of China to end immediately the forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong prisoners, to initiate an investigation which could lead to prosecution of the perpetrators, and to call upon the government of China to end immediately the persecution of Falun Gong. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights did nothing with this petition other than suggesting contact with the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crimes in Vienna, the UN bureaucracy responsible for trafficking in humans for the purpose of organ removal. Number 7, United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime. The UN Office for Drugs and Crime agreed to a meeting for March 2014 with a delegation to address organ trafficking in China. Shortly before the agreed date of the meeting, the office cancelled the meeting, claiming that they were busy. The delegation, having already made their travel arrangements, came anyways. They were then told by email after arrival that organ trafficking did not fall within the ambit of the office. An official email stated, "A meeting would not be productive, as my section's work, the human trafficking section, does not include what you refer to as organ harvesting or the other issues covered in your email." The UN office distinguishes between human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal, for which it asserts responsibility, and organ trafficking, which is the type of abuse in China, over which it claims it does not have jurisdiction. Number 8, United Nations Human Rights Council experts. 11 Human Rights Council experts, in a joint statement made in June this year, 2021, expressed extreme alarm at reports of alleged organ harvesting targeting minorities in detention in China. The experts called on China to allow independent monitoring by international human rights mechanisms. The Chinese government, in response, described witness testimony of this abuse as coming from actors making false statements in order to achieve their ulterior motive of dishonestly drawing the attention of international public opinion. As we saw with the reaction to the quoting of what Xi Bingyi said, attacking the messenger rather than the message is a common Communist Party tactic. The Chinese official response further referred to a number of laws which prohibit organ transplant abuse. This official response omitted to mention that Chinese police, investigators, prosecutors, judges, and defense bar are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and that the party does not use this legal system to prosecute itself. The response also omitted mention of the 1984 Chinese law, which allows for organ extraction from prisoners without their consent or the consent of their families when the bodies are unclaimed. The bodies of prisoners of conscience are often unclaimed because the relatives typically do not where their arbitrarily detained family members are, or even that they are detained. Moreover, even those family members who do know about the location of their detained relatives or wonder where they have gone are reluctant to ask anything of the authorities for fear of themselves getting into trouble with the authorities. So let me say this by way of conclusion. The United Nations system, as one might expect, is a reflection of the planet as a whole. There's some concern in bits and pieces at the UN for organ transplant abuse in China. However, it is sporadic, belated, piecemeal, haphazard, and insufficient. The response to the mass killing of innocents for their organs should be commensurate with the wrong, yet we are far from that now. The United Nations provides a platform for human rights concerned governments and experts to express their values and concerns. That platform can be used to a lot better effect than it has been to date when it comes to organ transplant abuse in China with prisoner of conscience victims. The United Nations presents an opportunity. Human rights respecting governments and experts should take advantage of that opportunity. The United Nations must not be an opportunity lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David May. It's truly an honor to have you on our panel today, and thank you for your expertise and truly an exceptional job that both you and your colleague David Kilgore have been doing over the years. This brings us to our last speaker for today, Andy Vermouth. Andy Vermouth described himself as a human rights advocate who started out at the age of 10, trying to find a way to fight social justice in our world. His motto is to always make the best of all circumstances, trying to give meaning to life as a defender of human rights, in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human, Civil and Political Rights and the European Fundamental Rights contained in the Lisbon Treaty. Andy Vermouth is currently affiliated with the International Alliance for the Defense of Rights and Freedom, AIDL, which is consulted by the United Nations and vice versa, an organization that promotes fundamental rights through a global state reform organized by citizens. Mr. Andy Vermouth, you have the floor.
Thank you. This morning, I already practiced Falun Gong for the first time in my life. So I was really happy to do it. It was really an experience. So I just wanted to say something before I begin with my official speech. I have audio transcriptions, 2 audio transcriptions of 2 former ministers of China, the Minister Bio Suchong, Minister of Health, and the Minister of Defense, Liang Zhuangli. I have audio transcriptions in which the system is actually saying that they have done this with the Falun Gong. So where ministers themselves are saying this. This is in Chinese. I can let it here because but people who want to hear it or to get it can get it from me. So I have the real transcriptions. This is in Chinese, talking with the minister. So I have 2 transcriptions of this. So this is really important before I start. So I won't let it here now, but if you want to hear it, you can come to me. Thank you. Okay. When individuals discussed the Chinese holocausts of organ thefts, I felt very uneasy. As a global world citizen, when I discovered our events internet link. All of this because the Holocaust refers to a very dark period in Western culture during which Jewish people were killed in gas chambers, sometimes burned alive and herded into camps for annihilation by Nazi Germany. Humanity's brutality reached an all-time high there. Therefore, it is my firm belief that we cannot use this term in any other contexts. Additionally, the term genocides should not be used casually. The United Nations defined genocide in 1948 in the Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of Genocide, in which they declared genocide to be an international crime and committed to preventing it and punishing it. In Article 2, this convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in a part a national, an ethnic, a religious, or a racial group, by murdering members of this group, inflicting serious bodily or mental harm on these people. It's a partial physical destruction, taking measures intended to repress the members of the group. When I consider this description, what is happening to the Chinese Falun Gong practitioners, it does not match the official United Nations definition of genocide here. If we consider all the elements for any genocide to be recognized by United Nations systems. This is in response to this Chinese organ theft and murder of individuals who are perfectly healthy and alive. I am introducing today a new notion, which I shall repeat many times here. I refer it to as China's thought genocide, for the first time with a new word, as it was a well-known, organized mindset origin sites. Mindset origin site. What does this imply precisely? Falun Gong practitioners are not affiliated with any one ethnic or religious group. It's not a minority. Since Falun Gong practitioners are found in the 56 ethnic groups across China, there are Falun Gong practitioners everywhere. Falun Gong is a harmonious synthesis of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. It's not a single ideology or religion. It's more philosophical and based on life knowledge. They, the Falun Gong, have been butchered and their organs sold as a commodity just because the Falun Gong, like you said, had become so large and dared to have their association of individuals from various ethnic backgrounds recognized in 1999. How is it possible that an organization that stands, not an organization, people, practitioners who stand for three fundamental concepts, most notably truth, compassion, and tolerance, the Falun Gong, has become a victim of a communist party that has turned the Falun Gong practitioners who peacefully practice meditation based on truth, compassion, and tolerance in an organization that threatens the Communist Party very existence, purely because they had 100 million members. I did it this morning. You can compare it with a sort of Chinese yoga. They don't like it if you say Chinese yoga. But being punished while you're doing meditation, it's crazy. As I discussed multiple times with our friend Nico Beinens here of Falun Gong, Belgium, this is not a genocide according to the United Nations official definition, which is why I use today, for the first time, of what Falun Gong practitioners have endured, the concepts of a mindset-based origin sites. To raise awareness, anyone accused of practicing Falun Gong's attitude or ideology and capable of listing these three principles that I mentioned was finally stripped of their organs, executed, and then burned and leaving no trace. Individuals who vanish into thin air. The Chinese have benefited from the Tiananmen experiences. They no longer do it openly, but have taught military physicians to take organs in an organized, clinical way as a distinct business inside industries, even using the organs of meditation practitioners as a selling feature. I too feel goosebumps when I consider these Chinese regime horrors, put an end to the Falun Gong practitioners' mindset-based origin sites, Han Chinese, Uyghurs, Mongols, Koreans, Tibetans, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, Russians, Uzbeks, Han-Chu are only 10 of the 56 ethnic groups, I won't mention them all, don't be afraid, who are victim of the Chinese Communist Party's all-seeing mindset-based origin sites. Then they claim that is how the first inquiry began. They placed advertisements on the websites of military hospitals and even private hospital. Thus, there is a connection with the government, which is already obvious. And then they said that they discovered adverts on their website indicating that anybody could travel to China for an organ transplant between 10 days to 3 weeks after arrival. That is, and they bring individuals to China. They have medical examinations on the spot, and then they provide you the assurance on forehand. And they say to you, you cannot make that type of guarantee, but they do it. They give you the assurance that you will get a good organ. And when the organ doesn't work, Nico Benen said it to me yesterday, they can do it 3 times. They can do it 3 times. Can you explain it, Nico? Can you explain it? What happened? Yes, can you explain it with somebody? 3 organs.
One example I heard, actually, I heard it from Mr. Edward William Scott, who shared this story about a practitioner, about a patient who received an organ that failed. Then he received another organ, which failed again, and then received a 3rd organ right after each other. So this is in the West, it's virtually impossible that
this is normally impossible. Knowing how scarce such organs are is just a matter of hours before the donor's death necessitates the transplant. Today and even tomorrow, we also call for an acknowledgement of the Chinese Communist Party suppression of the Falun Gong as an organized, mind-based, what did I say? Origin sites. Yes. Put an end to the mentality-based annihilation of Falun Gong practitioners. All 56 distinct ethnic groups of China are victims of this mindset-based origin sites at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. There were secret agreements struck with the Chinese government many years ago at the start of the Falun Gong persecution, in which they said that this goes hand in hand with the Chinese market's exponential expansion. And they said, all right, if you want to profit, if you want to benefit or economic success, that's okay. But we'll give you a list of topics we don't want you to touch. You may talk them with us, but only behind closed doors, which is precisely the same attitudes at the European consul's level here. So they said, all right. And then they obtained the list, and they informed us that the Falun Gong was at the top of the list of topics that can't be discussed. Numerous administrations in the whole European Union who adhere that and continue to ensure that they don't want to know.
I got a signal that the room has to go empty for another event. So
yeah, I'm almost kidding. I'm almost kidding. So the Falun Gong was never a sectarian group, which is critical to understand, not even faith. Yes, they will never attempt to mount you. Therefore, we conducted today additional investigations with the International Alliance for the Defense of Rights and Freedom and the International Fundamental Rights Organization, Post Versa, and discovered that over the last 20 years, an estimated total of 207,500 Falun Gong practitioners have been used for organ theft and murder. Not because they committed any wrongdoing, but because they practice a form of meditation. Incredible, even I had difficulty accepting this Chinese practice at first, until I saw the concrete proof of the pioneers, David Kilgore, David Matas, and Ethan Goodman. While the scope of these orchestrated assassination is currently restricted to 36 concentration camps, the fact is they are far greater, they are far bigger. I'm seeing that the number of organs transplantations occurring in China seems to be far higher than expected. However, the Falun Gong are very spiritual, and it is this spirituality that served as the foundation for almost the whole of the civilization. All various facets of society shared the spiritual base, and it was conducted within those three major teachings. If you take these three basic ideas from the teachings, you will see that there was no mention of discovering your inner self. Buddhism emphasizes compassion for all sentient creatures, whereas Confucius emphasized self-discipline, which is critical with considering those three principles: obtiner, vérité, compassion, et tolérance. And indeed, they are three essential concepts of Falun Gong. Put an end to the mentality-based annihilation of Falun Gong practitioners. All 56 ethnic groups, 56 minorities in China, are victims of this mindset-based origin-side under the all-seeing eye of the Chinese Communist Party. Li Lating became the head of the 16th office, an extrajudicial security apparatus, given the mandate to eradicate the Falun Gong. The CCCP party chief, Jiang Zemin, who ordered the start of the genocides on the 10th of June, 1999. The policy of the 16th office was defaming Falun Gong practitioners' reputations, bankrupting them financially, and destroying them physically. Put an end today to the mentality-based annihilation of Falun Gong practitioners. All 56 distinct ethnic groups are victims of this mindset-based origin-side under the all-seeing eye of the Chinese Communist Party. All of whom who are victims of this mindset-based organ-side allow us to meditate together, doing Falun Gong together, allow us to practice it in order to further our understanding of this mind-based origin-side, extend the meaning of the word origin-side, make it conscious everywhere, so this can never and never happen again. Many thanks, my friends.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andy Vermode. This brings us to the end of the list of our speakers and a conclusion of today's conference. Tackling this terrible crime of organ harvesting in China can only start with creating awareness. I think this conference, with the help of a very impressive list of speakers here today, will be able to create awareness and achieve that. From that point on, it's up to our policymakers as well as the media to first of all do your own research, find the courage, and go against this tidal wave coming our way from Beijing. This conference will become available as a permanent link on YouTube. So I would say spread the word and let more people know about this hideous crime, or as David Matas once described it, as a new kind of evil in our world. Thank to all our speakers, Mr. David Matus, Mr. Edward McMillan Scott, Mr. Peter van Dalen, Mr. Hamid Sabi, Ms. Kayan Wong, Dr. Howell King, Ms. Manel Salmi, and Mr. Andy Vermoot. Together with Mr. Gary Cartwright from EU Today, thanks a lot for initiating this event. It was a great honor for me to host it. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for watching online, and see you next time around. Bye-bye.